The personalities that matter with Keith Vaz on Talking Points.
Leica Radio.
Welcome back. This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Leica Radio. At the beginning of the programme, I talked about what was happening in Ukraine. And of course, this is constantly on our television sets and on the radio all the time. My special guest today is Dr. Radu Magdin, a political think tanker and CEO of Smartlink's Communications, a consultancy that focuses on political strategy. He has been involved with 3 national governments, giving them advice, and also he's a distinguished academic who continues to lecture at the National School of Political and Administrative Studies in Bucharest in Romania. He also holds a PhD in leadership resilience to Russian information operations. And we will be talking to him today about, obviously, the situation in Ukraine. He joins me this morning from Bucharest in Romania. Good morning, Dr. Radu Magdin.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me on.
Now, what is shocking, I suppose, is that everyone thought that the invasion would not happen. The Chancellor of Germany went over to see President Putin, so did President Macron. Were you surprised that rather than just securing the 2 southern areas of Ukraine, that the Russians actually invaded the whole country? Was this a surprise to you, or did you expect it?
It was a surprise to me. I believe it was an analytical surprise to a lot of experts or people who are looking closely at the region or at how Moscow thinks or is supposed to think. And I think our main mistake was that we actually looked at Moscow from a strategic, rational perspective. Even in terms of great power modeling, nonetheless a rational perspective. Because what is happening right now is close to madness. And even though, yes, they may have caught a moment of weakness in the West, and yes, they may cause disarray across the region, and most tragically, even beyond anything which is happening western of Ukraine, the actual situation of Ukrainians and the situation of Ukraine as a state right now, I would say, despite these tactical victories and this great power show, I think that history today and this week essentially will have said that red lines were crossed in the history of Europe after the Second World War, and there will be a price to pay beyond any kind of sanctions for Putin and the essentially war criminal regime right now in Moscow.
We'll come on to sanctions and other matters in a moment. What do you think his intention is? There are people who believe that what President Putin seeks to be is the new Peter the Great. He wants to restore the borders of Russia to Greater Russia, where it was basically before Gorbachev was president. Do you think that is his intention, that it's actually a much longer-term strategy than just taking over Ukraine?
First of all, let me tell you that greatness is not what it used to be. So I think that he would likely be remembered not as Vlad the Great, but as the Vlad the Tiny and Mean one. And from this perspective, I would simply say that I think a lot of us, speaking of reason and strategy and projections and risk management, we essentially thought that we're going to stop, at eastern Ukraine, and particularly parts of the provinces, and particularly for those of us who are into the strategic communications, let's say a game or profession, it was hard for us to distill 100%, at least as civilian operators, what's great political communications from the West, namely the leaks from intelligence services, and thank you UK and US for having warned us, and what were elements which could have been derailed from what we thought that the Russians were doing. Whereas, yes, you could say that we were successful initially in perhaps postponing part of the planning, and for sure we were successful in dismantling any kind of credibility from the narratives, and I mean the genocide accusations on the Ukrainians, right? And this never-ending Russian mania for neo-Nazis and so on. But I would say this is where our success ends. I think this is where our fight starts, because now it's a fight for the present and for the future, and our credibility, whether we like it or not, is at stake as well, because the whole world is watching. And even if NATO and even if the EU and even if global Britain, I have to commend the British government for being among the most active in terms of asking for sanction or moving quickly, and walking the talk. I would say that it's also a perception of power, and power can't be simply resumed to sanctions.
You're sitting there in Bucharest in Romania. Romania borders onto this troubled region of Europe. Poland is another country that borders onto Russia and the Ukraine. How worried are the Romanian people and the Polish people about what Russia is doing? Or are you fortified because you are in NATO and you know that if they cross the border into Romania or seek any influence, that'll activate all the allies in NATO? Are you worried at all? Is there any concern in Bucharest?
There is not an immediate concern for our safety, but since both Romania and Poland have a great recollection of the past, and particularly the not so great past, whether we're talking about attacks from multiple senses or the world wars, I would say that first of all, and here I would say that Poland has more skin in the game than Romania, because historically Ukraine or parts of Ukraine are, let's say, they have cultural affinity and ethnic affinity, and it's like a brotherhood in between Poland and Ukraine, like we Romanians have with Moldova. So as Romanians and as Poles, I would say we're particularly interested right now in making sure that there is a Polish resistance, that we can perhaps help even more at a certain moment in time. Separate from that, of course, the elements of solidarity. People are queuing at our borders and we're letting them in. We're trying to find facilities in hotels, in homes, in tents, whatever there's needed, so needed solidarity. And separate from that, of course, we're trying to avoid any kind of further security spillover. Particularly Romania is looking at Moldova from this perspective, and I'm afraid that in the following days we may be bordering again with Russia, or should I say, a renewed USSR.
This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Leica Radio. I'm talking to Dr. Radu Magdin, the head of the think tank Smartlinks Communications. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'm going to ask him about the effectiveness of sanctions.
Keith Vaz on Talking Points, Leica.
Welcome back. This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Leica Radio. I'm talking to the political analytical expert, the head of a think tank called Smartlinks Communications, Dr. Radu Magdin, who's talking to me from Bucharest in Romania. Dr. Magdin, the sanctions have been imposed by the EU, the United States, the G7, the United Kingdom. Do you think they're going to have any effect whatsoever?
Some effect for sure there will be. I mean, even if the West has been criticized for a lack of speed, for naivety, or for, let's say, partially siding with the enemy, if I may say so, due to business lobbies in different EU member states, due to, let's say, polarization of political environment in the US or in other countries and so on. But leaving that aside, even particularly the package that was agreed upon, compared with the first, round of sanctions, I think it's a dissuasive package. It doesn't mean that the Russians haven't necessarily expected it, and the main lobbying tool for sure remains, including some, let's say, weaker capitals in the EU, which are lobbying for them being kept in the SWIFT system, right? So that would be, if I may say it so, a nuclear option, in putting them to the right place in history. But until then, I would say, yes, their economy is going to be affected, but at the same time, the effects of this conflict, it shows in prices for commodities worldwide. Remember that Ukraine is also a major agriculture exporter, combined with the gas crisis that we're faced with and our already existing problems in terms of inflation. Our leaders have a cocktail of crises on their menus, which will make them either finally take decisions and be courageous and do what's needed in the next few months and years in terms of reassembling our economies, and our future plans, or we're going to be not only shamed, but also inefficient in doing the right thing at the right moment in time now with Ukraine.
Final questions. We've heard that UEFA have moved the final of the Champions League from St. Petersburg to Paris. Do you think those kinds of messages are important? I mean, some people might say it's only a football match. Do you think that kind of thing actually will start to penetrate Russian society?
I think the Russians are, again, evil number one in terms of, let's say, global leadership. So they managed to outscore the Chinese. And for sure, if there's a country right now who is, I would say, capitalizing on the situation, is China, simply because Russia does what it does and, for their own internal purposes. Yes, symbolism matters, but symbolism is not enough, speaking of solidarity. And yes, we could talk at a certain moment in time about the Ukrainian government in resistance, perhaps in London, in some other places, like it happened in the past with de Gaulle, and so on. But I think what's really, really important for the moment is that our thoughts and prayers and solidarity and actions of any kind go with the Ukrainians. Hopefully they can resist long enough, not necessarily to exhaust the Russians, but to allow allies to help one way or another. Of course, within the boundaries of international law. And speaking of cyclical arguments, this is the best argument for a future Ukraine in the EU and NATO. right? Simply because it shows that there are security concerns. And if we're going to be playing cynical on spheres of influence, at a certain moment in time, it's not going to pay off for us in the West either. What's the lessons for Romanians and Polish? Thank God we joined the EU and NATO. And we wish such a destiny also to other countries who are willing to do those reforms, but also willing to be left alone to join EU and NATO at the right moment.
Dr. Radu Magdin, you end on a very high note and an optimistic note. Thank you so much for joining us this morning from Bucharest in Romania and for sharing your thoughts. You're going to be extremely busy, I'm sure, as is Smartlink's Communications, giving advice to organizations, to businesses and to governments. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, and it's great to be in touch. And fingers crossed for Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.